All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Zaina, and I'm the assistant director for the Wilma's production of KISS. And today we're having a quick panel discussion about some of the topics that are brought up in the play. So I have two guests with me here today that I'll introduce. We have Kate Wilson here, who befriended the director Fadi when they were both working in applied theater with refugees in Amman and Jordan. She has worked as a playwright and theater artist, then earned a PhD in theater studies from CUNY with one specialization in Arabic theater, and now teaches Arabic culture among other subjects in New York City. And our other guest is Edward Ziter, who is a theater historian with particular interest in the intersections between European and Arab performance traditions. His most recent book, Political Performance in Syria from the Six-Day War to the Syrian Uprising from 2014, was a co-winner of the Joe A. Calloway Prize for the best book on drama or theater. His article, Theater of the Syrian Diaspora, will appear in the forthcoming Palgrave Handbook on Theater and Migration. He serves as the editor of the Journal of Arab Stages. That sounds amazing. So obviously I have very, very wonderful guests here.
Check it out.
Yeah, these are both very wonderful people who have both taken the time to watch our production of KISS and are excited to talk to you all about some of the themes they noticed. So just to jump right in about some of the questions that I have prepared. So you both watched KISS. KISS is a play about what Western theater artists and performance makers do during times of crisis, and an exploration of the ways in which solidarity is imagined and performed. So I'd love to ask a first question, which is, what space do you feel like this holds for impacted people from crisis and war, as well as for theater artists and performance makers, as well as for the audience? Starting off general.
Kate, do you want to jump in? Shall I?
Go for it.
So, obviously one of the central themes is who has control of the image of the displaced person, of the person in a war zone. Can one circulate that image in good faith, for good reasons, or do people lose control of their own image? So I think it has a lot of currency, precisely because we're in the midst of the worst migration crisis since World War II. Internet and news services are awash with images of displaced people. In Europe and the US, we have control over our image. We can determine how it's going to circulate, and we can object if we feel that it's communicating meanings that are inconsistent with us. But those rights really aren't afforded people of displaced peoples. And this has been a subject for some artist collectives that are representing Syrian people. So, for example, there's the artist group Abu Nadara that has published a book recently about the loss of the image. And is there a way that displaced people can retain not only control of their images, but what those images mean? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it's the issues that the production poses are especially relevant for displaced people today.
Yeah, this idea of representation, absolutely.
I agree with Ted, and I just take a different angle also, that I see the play as asking what Western or English-speaking arts or theater specifically, how they can interact with people in conflict zones. We might say Syria, but it could be perhaps generalized to conflict zones, especially in the global South. I don't. My thought process didn't direct more towards this play and then people actually in Syria or in refugee camps having fled Syria, as much as back home, among those who are interested in these interactions of culture from those conflict zone places. And I do think it raises important questions about how do you do that? So it's us. How do we do that? And that includes the audience as well as the artists. And then backing up is why did these fictive actors, the actors playing actors, why did that troupe choose to do this? But then also, and how do they do it? And I think there's suggestions that the way this troupe went about it is not Orientalist exactly, or it doesn't show signs of that kind of misinterpretation, but still hasn't quite hit the mark. And that there's something more that, and I think my sense is that this might be asking us to think about what is it that we want from those interactions? What do we expect the other, the Syrian, the person in the conflict zone, or as the displaced refugee, what do we expect them to do for us, or what are we kind of asking or perhaps commanding them to tell us, and what are we willing to hear, what are we willing to listen to?
That's great. Yeah. So kind of going off of what you're saying about this idea of them getting it wrong. So I kind of want to probe a little further in that. So what do you feel are like the effects of the mistakes that the troupe in the play make? They do this soap opera, they think they get it right, everyone claps at the end, and they're given a bit of a reckoning. So what do you feel like? Do you feel like it's possible for them to correct it? And what can we learn from their mistakes watching it unfold on stage in a very public and embarrassing way, some might argue?
Kate, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think there's different levels here, and I think your production made choices in the end about that actually I think is quite optimistic, and it's a sort of redemption story in a way that they did seem to learn from it, because there are hints about audiences all the way through. That when we learn that the play was written for people who will be in living rooms, but we also see people who gather to watch televised drama in the form of the TV, in the form of the soap opera. So the characters we see are supposed to be audiences regularly to TV drama. And then towards the end, one of the main actors says, we were afraid at how our audience would receive what they're calling melodrama, which then in retrospect, I think makes us, this real audience, makes us understand why they made those choices of parody, or that they distance from the sincerity that they would later do. So that's the effect kind of inside is about the actors realizing and changing, which I think, as I said, is optimistic. And then I wonder about what is meant for our reflexiveness, that is to say, the audience, like, what are we supposed to think? And do we look back and say, I was complicit with that parody?
Yeah.
And so does that make me question my response to cultural forms like melodrama, that feel different, and that I might feel condescending towards, or that I might find ridiculous? And so I have that position of superiority. Am I supposed to then leave the show and say, okay, I found that humor in ridiculing in the first part, so let me question that? So that's one, I'm not saying that's definite, but one of the possibilities that I left with.
Yeah, continuing on that, one way of thinking about the question is to think about the dilemma an audience member feels at the end of the first act, where they have to choose whether or not to applaud. I mean, the house lights come up, the convention is that you applaud, but you probably aren't quite certain what you're applauding, especially as the play continues and the talkback makes it clear that you are participating in, at best, a misunderstanding of a text, and at worst, a kind of misuse of a text for somewhat maybe crass purposes. And the degree to which they can, I mean, the other question is what happens in that second act? Is it that the actors have kind of rethought it and they are now able to engage with the reality of the lives that they misrepresented? Or is it a kind of just a shift into another register where we're now seeing not a representation of people in Syria, but a kind of a manifestation of those people, as if they've taken control of these actors' bodies. So if in the first half of the piece, you have these actors who are playing with someone's narrative to create a piece that might make a splash, or allows them to kind of pose meta-theatrical questions, is the second part a piece where those displaced people somehow are able to exert control over those actors. I mean, it's such a profound tonal shift. I'm not inclined to, I didn't so much experience it as, oh, now they're getting it right, so much as now their bodies are suddenly in service to these displaced peoples. It's kind of a utopic gesture that these actors could become the instrument by which the people of Syria could tell their story.
So
or at least that they, like when you're pointing to bodies, it's, and you said, do they understand? It seems to be an emotional sort of, and perhaps less conscious. I don't know that they know what they're realizing, or that they're meant to seem as if they know what they're realizing, but that they now have emotional access that they didn't have before they were making a reading of it being over the top melodrama and playing it in that way. But in the second half, because of the intervention of the woman, the writer or her sister or something, because of the intervention, and then that they have to go through the lines knowing that there are codes they don't understand, that there's layers of meaning, and now actually enacting the gunshots that they left out cavalierly of the first part. And so that's why I would call this an optimistic reading, in the sense that the actors can come to not necessarily a linguistic discursive articulation of what was happening, but that they seem to be able to access feelings that perhaps still might be outsider feelings, but it is more of a recognition.
So how do you feel like the choice at the end of the play to include projection mapped renderings of destruction, how does that feel like it changes the ending? Or how does that, especially for an audience, this go from this place representation to this rendered world that we've created at the last moment? How does that impact it?
So I mean, again, I experienced it not, one way of experiencing the ending is, okay, now the actors are going to try to get it right. But then the other way to experience it is now the reality of that experience is just going to impose itself upon the stage. And the actors are almost like there to transmit someone else's experience. And when the set flies away and we see the destruction, that was my sense, was just that this is a reality that's going to impose itself on this theatrical artifice. Of course, in the context of the current earthquake, I think any audience is now going to experience this in relationship to the images they're seeing, broadcast right now. So that also kind of contributes to this just sense that the now is going to impose itself on this piece.
That you mean the particular now of the moment?
Yeah, the particular now of the failure of I mean, the fact that relief agencies can't get into northern Syria, that Aleppo, even though it's under the control of Damascus, is not seeing any kind of relief efforts. that the reality of what it means for an earthquake to happen in a war zone is terrifying.
I don't think I didn't quite separate out the visual, although I took note of it, but it's in conjunction with a song, and we haven't heard a song, and the song is in Arabic, and we no longer have the interpreter. Anglos, non-Arabic speakers, no longer have the interpreter, so they're reminded of knowing that until one line is translating. And then Bana or Laura is monologuing, and it is monologuing as if in the reality. I understood it, the reality of Damascus, not the reality of the Lebanese refugee camp. And so now she's narrating sort of pretty ad hoc or almost improvisational and not quite linear or sort of somewhat non sequitur. So there's those three things coming together. I think one thing that it does is it relates to the larger theme or the problem that the troupe first responded to the play, even though they sought out young Syrian playwrights in conflict. They sought that out, but then they read it through this sort of universal, what we sometimes call humanist lens, of where everything is going to be universal, love triumphs, or it's about truth. I think it's about the idea of lying and truth. And what the intervention in dialoguing with the woman does is insist on a localism, that meanings aren't universal and are very mediated by the local, and you didn't understand this code of KISS and who this name meant, this actress, what that would have meant. And so even in the second one, when it's more charged, it could still be universal. That these could be people in some sort of, like, with layers of difficulty and having strong emotion about their love geometry. But then the photo of the bombed out buildings then goes back and insists on that the reason for these charged emotions is tied to this kind of, at least this kind of place, if not specifically, we didn't see a street sign, for example. So it's this kind of area. And so I think it is correcting or a critique against that sort of seeking what has to be universal. It has to be at the level of universal always, and that meanings, and also emotions, affects shift by or take on different tenors in different locations, particularly with conflict and troubles like those.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about different groups of audiences seeing this show and kind of what it does for each of them, like the American, the non-American, Western or European, or somebody who's part of the diaspora coming and seeing this show? Kind of what does this play do for each of those people that have come together to see this show?
Well, I mean, a Syrian audience is going to know who May Scoff is. They're going to, when she's referenced, they're going to know that she was, organized a petition to end the siege of Dara early in the uprising, that she organized artists in demonstrations, that she was briefly detained. They're going to know that she then fled once she was released. They're also going to know that she was a superstar of television series, and that her outspoken opposition to the Assad regime kind of inflected the roles she played. So she was in one television series that's set during resistance to the French regime during the Mandate period, and it's easy to conflate her character in that, resisting the French, with her statements about the Assad regime subsequently. I think that would be meaningful for them. And when they hear the song, Yamama Wal Hawa, they're going to recognize it as a song that had been kind of, it's an old song, and as you were saying, it's associated with the Palestinian resistance, but that, as you noted earlier, or you explained to me, I didn't know this, that that it was first performed, in Egypt, but that certainly post 2011, it became very much associated with the resistance to the Assad regime. They're going to know that song.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to have familiarity with those qualities, those aspects. I don't know, that moment of discomfort when you realize that you've been laughing at a show that's been getting it wrong. I don't know how that would. I imagine that would be a very different experience for a Syrian than for an American.
I think the play itself, I think, insists on the local audience and meanings with the local audience, and so that would kind of depend on this particular theater and this particular production, because then the different production might be different, and for Anglos, for people who don't understand Arabic, there's I think a sort of dislocation or of needing the translator, needing the interpreter.
Yeah.
I do think the production was compassionate and broke up long passages and had him do it like UN style, almost simultaneous, rather than wait. But there are moments where a non-Arabic speaking audience doesn't understand what's happening, and we're used to everything being rendered for our comprehension, which ties back to sometimes naively believing we can access meaning, or we can do a Google search, and that's kind of enough to know what is it like for the other in their particular context.
Yeah, well, this is a great segue to talk about the interpreter, who is a very fun character to put on stage, as well as the choice that the director in this production made to have Amita's sister, the woman, as well as the interpreter on stage during the Zoom call, as opposed to keeping up with the illusion that they are in a faraway place. They're very separate. And I would love to hear about your opinions on just like the role of the interpreter on the interpretation. How does this translation work with this script that Calderón made, and how it affects this understanding between Americans and Syrians, and how does it play with that a little bit?
I mean, well,
the interpreter. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Kate, please.
Well, I might be jumping ahead to meta theater or play within a play. I've never encountered a play within a play that actually had interpretation or Skype, which might have to do with history, but technology history. But so to have the interpreter in a play within a play is really adding these interesting dramatic layers, and your production chose to sometimes break the frame, particularly with the interpreter crossing over. So it's one of the instances that highlights language in the basic sense of non-Arabic speakers can't understand woman, Amira's sister, while she is speaking, and then we must wait for the interpretation. But I think, and I think that connects to other moments, even when we do understand the language, and even when conversations are quite simple, hello. I believe the play and also the production are really highlighting aspects of taking a normal conversation and making it highlighting that there's things happening in that very much. And in some ways that came through because of the parody, but I think it's also then even later on. So just a brief moment where I think it's Martin or Daniel is supposed to start the start Skype, and he doesn't, and he says, "Oh, sorry," and he says sorry 3 times in one sentence. In linguistics, that's called repair. That you fix something, and so there's all these. It's sprinkled throughout of these moments of the little negotiations that people are doing to make sure they understand or not understand, and then not hearing that she doesn't hear that the misinterpretation of the play. She doesn't hear it right when it happens. She then refers back to it later on. So the interpreter really emphasizes issues of communicating actually even in the same language, and whether we understand each other or not, and how much work it takes to do that. But then certainly that it needs this extra step, and that goes back to a kind of critique of the Anglo-American, like wanting the easy route to the voice of the other, and that they couldn't, like, the rights were hard because of Arabic, you know, so like they couldn't quite make that extra step to deal with the language to then handle something like banal as copyright. So I saw the interpreter on a continuum of these kind of highlighting language and highlighting bumps, but also what kind of work it takes.
I'll just add that I thought it was a great choice. It was very theatrical. It allowed us to see the interpreter's discomfort with the questions, and his interactions with her as they're happening. It also, it's also a kind gesture in that it cues the audience into the fact that the play is still going.
Yeah.
You know, when I was watching the video, I thought, oh, are the house lights on? Is anybody standing up to leave? Do they know that this Q&A is actually scripted and part of the play? So obviously bringing the interpreter and Amira's sister on stage cues the audience that it's not over yet. So.
Yeah, and I love this idea of negotiation that you mentioned, Kate, because I feel like not only are they living in this world of negotiation between languages, but they're also living within this social decorum of being on stage in front of an audience they just performed for and are supposedly leading this talk back, assuming that the playwright was going to say, "You guys did a wonderful job. Thank you so much for doing my play." And the audience would be like, "Wow, such smart actors. You guys did an amazing job. We loved your play." And then when it's not that, you're suddenly getting witnesses to your mistake. And there's like this added layer of negotiating, what do we do now? And I feel like having that as the forum for the miscommunication or the reckoning that these American actors have, I feel like is an interesting choice. So I'd love to hear what you thought about the role of the audience in that moment as the house lights come up and they're hearing the actors communicating against their will, really, to this to their mistakes.
Well, I mean, you're cringing because you're witness to a misunderstanding and a failure, but you're also conscious of your own role in it. I'm sure the audience has conflicted emotions, and it's also just interesting that in addition to the piece being meta-theatrical and asking, I mean, it poses the question, what is this production doing? It's not as if it's the Wilma theater production gets off scot-free. The Wilma theater is essentially subjecting themselves to the same criticism that they're imposing upon this fictional theater company. In the audience, we are both the audience for the play within the play, but we're also the audience for the actual show. So even if we can distance ourselves from that other audience that we were forced to perform, right? We were forced to perform the role of the audience at this misguided production, and now we get to be relaxed and present at this as the audience at the at the actual thoughtful production,
Mhm.
the question of whether or not it's a thoughtful production still kind of lingers in the air. And by association, whether or not we are complicit in the false production.
Yeah, I do think that the play is thinking about audience, even when it's not even when we're not emphasized and there's not a breaking the frame so directly to us. Nobody splashes water on us or makes us get up and participate or refers to our our hair color or anything like that. It's not so direct. So I think that part is a little bit between the lines, but it's having that effect because audience has been mentioned, and we'll learn that they changed the play because of the audience. And so yeah, there is that shift. And also we know the genre of post-show Q&A or interview Skype or interview or something like that. And so there's the layers of that. We're used to that being the total shift. And indeed the actors change clothes, but that should be the total shift. And now it's not actors, it's those people. I mean, now it's the actors, not the characters. And it's we should be in a different zone, but for us, we're still in the zone of this theater show put on by the Wilma. I do wonder how any of you will ever do how you'll ever do a real Q&A. So I think it's thinking about audience, and it's also thinking about these genre. The protocols or the devices around a play, like you have to get rights, and they couldn't really do that. And how do you find a play? They did the easy route of going online, but then also the post show, and so it's even bringing in that genre. It's just they didn't mention ticket prices, but that's about it. So that it's thinking that not just the show is not just the text that we got, but it has this other apparatus around it, and that's one of the things that's different in Damascus, that they would put it on in a living room because there was no operating theater for them to use. And so highlighting that difference of where a show happens, how you prepare for it, and then something like a Q&A, and I guess maybe the program, people are going to notice the playbill because it would have signaled to them, don't leave. So all of these things are also meta, are also heightened and calling attention to the apparatus of theater that again is affected by harsh conflict zone conditions in other places.
Yeah, that reminds me that the Malice brothers at the time of the early in the uprising were doing theater projects in their bedroom. And they were imprisoned alongside Mayscoff after the Artists' March following the siege of Dara. So I wonder if the playwright was familiar with that, if they had done research, or if it was just a coincidence.
I would love to hear your thoughts on some of the intermedial choices of the play. Because the play lives in so many different registers, that it's an American theater troupe putting on a soap opera or a script of a soap opera, Syrian soap opera meant for television on stage in front of a live audience. And I'd love to hear kind of what your thoughts are on their interpretation of a Syrian soap opera.
So anthropology has studied Arab soap operas, and then particularly Syrian soap operas, and one does have to make us. It is a similar style. The style would be recognizable, but the importance maybe is a bit different, and then some aspects of who watches might be different, and so that part is, as far as I know, is somewhat accurate, that what seems to be middle class could be watching it, and that it's an occasion for social gathering, and also that this is coming from the scholarship of Krista Salamandra, who worked on this before the Civil War, that because of problems in theater, a lot of talent in writing and directing was driven or moved over to the to the TV series, and so it's not quite that harsh distinction of, we think of sharp talent going to live arts, and then the other one is corrupted by commerce. There is that difference there, and then also not all about whether the arts, whether live theater arts defines itself against TV and film. We are not TV and film. We're stage arts, or whether it's understood as a continuum. I think is also another thing that the play is raising.
Yeah, I mean, the actors want to think of the soap operas as a space of naivete, both a naivete that they're celebrating. Oh, it's so passionate, it's so open, but also that they're presenting, in quotation marks, as a way of distancing themselves from a less sophisticated form. And obviously what they miss is that this script is using the idea of the soap opera not because it's this genre that the Amira sisters interested in, so much as it's a way of referencing how a particular artist had been abused by the regime. So, and
also that it's that
it's a place of nostalgia for a time.
Nostalgia, which is interesting because many of the real world, so the real world TV series are nostalgic for a much deeper era, like the Arab Empire type of era. So and Syria, the great epochs of Syria. So that is actually true, but this play is making it more for the Civil War. And what's interesting about that is the Amira's sister says it's nostalgia for simple things, love, but in that first section when we're watching the play, we don't see the love geometry as simple. And so again, from this kind of universal, we're looking for love and themes of love and truth. This looks complex, and there's all these reversals and revelations, and how can you trust? And that could be like that could be complex, or that could be enough for this sort of the kind of actor that the show is satiring. It could be enough for them, and for her, she's calling that simple, relative to the other ones. So through the soap opera, that the soap opera style, that's what that's eliciting.
That it would be so hard for Americans to understand the script, so we have to do something to it to either make it more universal or make it fit within our American troupe bodies on stage.
That's the lens that, they decide that it's melodrama. And they read it through that lens, and so it has to be melodrama, but our audience is going to find that ridiculous and it's pathetic, and so we're going to parody it. But what I mean is, even inside that script, the story, straightforward, seems complex because it's a love geometry, and then this one reveals and this one reveals. So what looks like a complex love geometry, she calls simple. And so something like that kind of love geometry is a simple thing that we're nostalgic for, the way we might say gaslight on streets or something, or 25-cent ice cream cones.
But then ultimately that in truth, it's an analogy or a metaphor for approaching a political violence or torture and sexual abuse that can't be articulated explicitly. So
yeah, and those are political realities
that's what they miss. They miss that it's not the power of the script isn't in that it's telling a love story. It's in that it uses a love story to disguise acts of political violence.
Right. And they couldn't see past it because it was already. I mean, could they not see past it because it was already just so foreign to them that even that was just like such a gap they had to cross?
Well, I don't really know that anybody would. I mean, the conceit is that, you know, a Syrian audience would immediately recognize that this is about Maskov. They would recognize that this is all, a metaphor for political violence and torture. But I don't, and that conceit is necessary to explore what happens when well-intentioned artists make use of the bodies of people in war zones for their own artistic practice. I don't know in reality if a Syrian audience saw that soap opera, they'd go, oh, that's about Maskov. The character, she does mention, I played a character named May. But you know, there's never been any, as the play acknowledges, there's never been any assertion that Maskov was subjected to torture or rape in prison. So I don't know that there's some ideal audience that would have actually understood the metaphor, but that's not important. What's important is that the play asks us to imagine that there was a metaphor that is missed. And that's what, you know, what it wants us to do. It wants us to examine our position to, you know, works of art that attempt to, you know, make use of other people's suffering for artistic purposes, and then to question why it is we find that pleasurable and interesting.
Yeah,
and then,
there's
But no, backing up for the artist to say, if one is inspired to do that, how do you do it? So it's it is almost absurd that KISS is coded as you know, it's a stretch of the imagination, and I don't think that's meant to be quite literal, that fictive Syrian audiences would have understood that KISS would have meant possible rape or some sort of violent intimacy, as they put it. But the point is in the how, that the theater troupe was content to find a script online and then felt ready to put it up. And so it's a complacency in when are we ready to understand it? We get the script, we see that it's melodrama. Our audiences might think that's pathetic, and so we will so it's backing up to the how of the artistic practice in approaching the other, in wanting to, as Ted says, like perform the bodies of the others in conflict zone.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up another example, which was the coughing. And so she mentions that coughing was this other metaphor, that if somebody's coughing, she's been exposed to chemical weapons, which our director, Fadi, who's Syrian, even called up his other Syrian friends and was like, would you have gotten that? If you saw that in a TV show, would you have seen somebody who's coughing and said, oh, it's a chemical weapons attack? And they were like, not really. I don't think that's what I would have gotten out of that.
Though May Scoff did a dance piece in France outside the Chaillot National Theater about the Route chemical attack. So again, I'm wondering if the reference to chemical weapons isn't in fact someone having done some research in the kinds of dissident art that Maskov continued to do in exile. But no, you're right. I mean, I don't think any audience would see coughing and think, oh, that's a reference to chemical attacks.
No, I don't think that. I don't take that part literally in like, let's see, in believing the woman, Amira's sister, and believing what she says. I don't think that as drama, I don't think we need to walk away and believe that, but it is a reminder that we don't know the codes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
whether or not they're actual codes is immaterial. The point is we don't get the codes.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so the coughing was, we had 3 Arabs from each from different countries who are all working on this script together, and each of us kind of sharing our understanding and our own personal knowledges. And I feel like, yeah, just because something is politically in awareness in this mode, in seeing it in a soap opera, would somebody have been like, in a love soap opera, would they have been like, that's a chemical attack, I know where this is going? And would the white audience have, or the American audience have, kid themselves and be like, oh, of course I should have known that, or I would have known that.
No, I think it's in general about signs and signals, because there's also like about smiling and who's smiling and who nonverbal signals, who is smiling, and what once a woman says they're pregnant, what that's going to imply that the father's going to stay after all. So it's there's a bunch of different bodily things, and then even gunshots, that gunshots and bombs mean that there's war outside. So there's verbal codes and verbal signals, and we think we understand, but actually there's a lot of bumbling even in the same language. And so I think it's kind of on that, like on those spectrums, or on that register of how complex codes are, and criticizing the complacency that you think you know, that you think you know what a signal or an indicator such as a cough is.
Yeah, so this is just maybe a little broader of a question, but where do you feel like there is a line between political solidarity, in this case between Americans and Syrians who are suffering under war, and cultural appropriation of taking an image or taking a story that isn't yours, or even embodying a body that's not yours and putting it on stage? Is there room for good intentions there?
Well, I don't think there's a I don't think there's a list of best practices. I don't think you can just go through the checklist. I think it is always, there's always the potential for misuse, or for an undermining, or for working against your intentions, your good intentions. And I think the only thing that you can do is create work that examines what you're doing as you're doing it, right? So this would be an example. This piece, this play would be an example of theater work that wants to think about the experiences of people in conflict zones, and also wants to be self-reflective and aware of how different parties benefit and who doesn't benefit, and how people may feel that they've lost control of their own image, and that these are inevitable possibilities, that there will always be the danger of misuse the minute you try to speak about anyone's experience. The minute you take 5 feet from your own personal experience, you run the risk of misusing images that belong to other people. And the best that you can do is to do it in a way that is self-aware and open to critique.
Yeah, Guillermo Calderón is not Syrian, and so he himself is an actor. I mean, he's representing the Syrian being misrepresented, and so there's a level at which he is doing that, and then what is the production directed by a Syrian with Arab American dramaturgs?
Yeah, and even Fadi is always careful to emphasize that he left Syria before. He was in Jordan, working in Jordan long before the uprising began. He is not a displaced person. So even the theater company got a Syrian to direct it, but even then, that Syrian's experiences are very different from the people depicted in the play.
Yeah, but I meant that, like, there's some there's a Chilean author representing this. Yeah, and
it's complicated.
right, and then the
And they're not talking about it.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, why are we empowered to talk about it?
So in that case, is there room for any kind of political solidarity in that case? And kind of furthering, and like, and furthering it out, like, what is the effect of putting on this play now, 10 years after it was written? It was written in 2013 during the height of the refugee crisis, where everyone seemed to be talking about Syria and it was all over the headlines, and it disappeared once we hit the 2020s, and now due to a devastating earthquake has popped up in headlines now, but for different reason. That what is the effect of doing a play about Syria 10 years later, where we're not talking about the war?
It is about Syria, but then it also the way Syria functions in the play does lend itself towards generalizing to conflict zones, troubled regions. There's not that much particular, like the particularities of Syria don't close it down to it. It does mean conflict zones and trouble, and in this case it means Arabic, but I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think that it could be different, that it could lend itself to generalizing to us in a privileged position and how we acting for artistic solidarity or other kinds of solidarity with other places. So I think it lends itself to that. But again, I think the play is trying to provoke us to think, but how do we do it? It's nice that we want to, but how is it that we do it?
I mean, if nothing else, the play does remind us that the Civil War is ongoing, that there are millions of people who are displaced who at this point have no opportunity to return, spread out in refugee camps in surrounding nations and in Europe. And so I do think there's a value in mounting the play, and I do think that there's a value also in mounting a play specifically that asks us to examine what happens when we try to mount plays about other people.
Yeah, I totally wasn't keeping track of the time, and I believe we're out of time, but I wanted to leave you some room if you had any other lingering thoughts, what your opinions are about post reading the script, post watching our production of it and this theater in Philadelphia.
Well, I just wanted to say, I thought the design was beautiful. I just thought, it was just well performed, well acted, well directed. I thought there were so many performances I could highlight that were, I just thought, super compelling and interesting. Yeah, I thought it was a big success. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm trying to deal with the guilt of pleasure in the first part and trying to figure out a way of how I can make space for at least enjoying that style. So I'm just wondering if the Wilma could take a bad American TV show and do that.
Yeah,
and I won't have to feel so guilty. I'm sort of really encouraged to see a playwright and then the production using this tradition of meta theater, of play within a play, in a political sense, and then with updating with Skype and with our situation of global interactions, even if naive or bumbling in this case. And so with the cross language, because I was scratching my head and thinking, so with metadrama, are there precedents? And I couldn't see the precedents for that whole combination. And metadrama is terrific for social critiques of all kinds, and I think here it's very provocative to the audience to think about their relationships to others in the global South or in conflict zones.
Yeah, and I think there's this very strong idea of doing something, thinking you're doing a good job, being told that you did it incorrectly, and then trying again. And when I think in a lot of cases, people would have said, you cut your losses, you apologize, you save face, and you hope you don't do it again. And this play puts us in this uncomfortable position of watching people try again, and what they discover or don't discover or don't end up finding in the end, having tried again. So it asks all of those questions that I think are really interesting in terms of understanding the other, like, as an American. But yeah. All right, great.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. From New York City. Yeah. Thank you both so much.